Hi, in this presentation, we're looking at really the bulk of the genetics vocabulary, and we're connecting those terms um, in addressing the idea of traits and their connection to genes, little segments of DNA, and alleles, which are different forms of a gene. And I love this picture here um, because as much as we're going to learn about Mendelian genetics and eventually, do Punnett squares and predict genetic possibilities and outcomes, the reality is there are many ways that traits are inherited. And this is obvious in this picture here of so many different eye colors. So it's not like you either have brown eyes or blue eyes. There are many shades of brown. There's hazel, there's green, there's many shades of blue. There's almost people that have gray eyes. So, as much as we want to look at traits as this or that, the reality is in human genetics, that doesn't apply the majority of the time, but it's still fun to talk about it and make these predictions and do Punnett squares. And yeah, there are some traits that follow these characteristics, but there are some more complex genetics at play. So the first big concept or big picture to take in is that if we're looking at a chromosome, which we've learned about chromosomes, they contain DNA. And DNA has little chunks of it, essentially, that are genes. And your genes make proteins, and your proteins give you your traits or your characteristics. So, this little band here, this banding represents a gene on this chromosome. And this gene is found at this location or locus. So this copy of the chromosome has this copy of the gene. This chromosome has this copy of the gene. And they must have two copies of a particular gene. So they need one copy for wrinkled in this case and one other copy of the wrinkled gene. So quantifying some more vocabulary here, we have this term allele. And I'm just going to go up here and circle that for you. An allele is essentially a form of a gene. So we represent this form of a gene gets digested down as we do genetics problems into letters. And each parent gives one allele for every gene. So for a given gene, you have two copies, one from mom and one from dad. And that goes for every gene. And again, those genes give you your traits and characteristics. So the alleles are just different forms of the gene. And we can use our genetics vocabulary to describe those alleles. So the first genetics vocabulary term I want to address here is homozygous. And homozygous means two of the same alleles. So see how there's wrinkled and wrinkled? They're both yellow. Those alleles are homozygous. On the other hand, we have heterozygous. Heterozygous alleles are different. So in this case, one wrinkled in yellow and one round in blue. So different alleles, heterozygous, two of the same, homozygous. And the interesting part is we can even build upon that vocabulary by describing these alleles and representing them using letters. So our Alleles are represented by letters. And in that, we can describe those letters as homozygous or heterozygous. And we have the word dominant allele, which is a capital letter, represented by a capital letter, and recessive allele, which is represented by a lowercase letter. And these are all part of your genetics vocabulary terms. We also have homozygous. Another name for homozygous is true breeding or purebred. And heterozygous, another name for heterozygous is hybrid. Keep that in mind. So homozygous, two of the same alleles, and we can have homozygous dominant, in this case, capital E, or homozygous recessive, lowercase e, lowercase e. Homozygous dominant, capital R. Homozygous recessive, lowercase r, lowercase r. If we jump over to heterozygous or hybrid, this is two different alleles represented by one capital letter and one lowercase. So capital E, lowercase e, capital R, lowercase r, so on and so forth. So there's a lot of opportunity to practice word problems and applications in this vocabulary, using this vocabulary. In this example here, it says determine the allele combinations for the following trait. Brown eyes are dominant over blue eyes. So this information is telling you that and this is just an example. This is not necessarily true to life. We're just going through a sample problem here. In saying brown eyes are dominant over blue eyes, brown eyes are represented by capital letter alleles, whereas blue eyes would be representative of lowercase alleles. And the thing is, with the idea of dominance and recessiveness, dominant alleles will cover up a recessive allele, so they can hide that trait. That trait can be there, but they can't, and it might not be shown. So I want you to write out the homozygous dominant allele combination, and this individual would have brown eyes. The homozygous recessive letter or allele combination for blue eyes, and the heterozygous allele combination for brown eyes. So pause the video here and do that now. All right, welcome back. Hopefully you paused the video. I'm going to go over the answers. So homozygous dominant means two capital letters. So we're using the letter capital B. So the answer would be capital B, capital B. Homozygous recessive would be two lowercase b's, because recessive alleles are represented by lowercase letters. And heterozygous is one capital and one lowercase. So hopefully you practice that on your own. All right. As we move forward here, something that was addressed, I brought up, but I didn't get too terribly into it, is this idea of what an organism looks like because of those letters. And what an organism looks like is its phenotype. Those are the traits or the physical characteristics. Now, what determines the phenotype or the physical characteristics is the genotype. So very, very important here. Genotype determines phenotype. Sorry, I kind of X'd out that. I didn't mean to X it out. I meant to more highlight it. So genotype determines phenotype. So here we have a genotype capital A, capital I. We can see in our moths here two capital letters, that moth is dark in color. So the genotype is the letters, the phenotype is how the moth looks or its traits. Here in our next example, we have capital A, lowercase a. Notice both alleles are present. This would be heterozygous, one capital, one lowercase. But in terms of how it looks, this moth is dark in color because the capital or dominant allele covers up the lowercase allele. So it covers it up. It's like it's not there. It's like it's yellow. Okay? But the reality is it can get passed on. And that's how we get this idea of skipping generations, traits skipping generations, which is cool. The only way to get a light colored moth is if you have two of those recessive alleles. So the only way a recessive trait shows is if there are two copies of that lowercase letter present. Okay, and in the next slide, we've got our kind of last little summary of what is happening. So here is explained the concept of dominance versus recessiveness. So depending on the letter combinations, the allele combinations, that will determine the phenotype or how the organism looks. Dominance or dominant alleles will show even if there's just one copy. So we can see here, round is dominant. It will show this P is round. The only way to get a wrinkled P is to have two copies of that recessive trait. And look, now we've got a wrinkled P. Okay, this idea is summarized in that dominant alleles will mask or cover up a recessive allele. All right, and again, this is application of our genetics vocabulary, and soon we'll be ready to start doing some Punnett squares. Please, please, please make sure you understand all those terms: dominance, recessiveness, genotype, phenotype, heterozygous, homozygous, true breeding or purebred, and hybrid. All right, thank you so much.